Reading with your kids.
Hola, ni hao, konnichiwa, assalamu alaikum, shalom, mahaba, moni moli wanji, namaste, jumbo, bienvenidos. Hi, my name is Jedley, and this is the Reading with Your Kids podcast. We are coming to you from the beautiful neighborhood of Reedville in the southwest corner of Boston, Massachusetts. We are so delighted and so honored that you're joining us in our mission to help all families grow closer through reading. Please be sure to tell all of your family and friends about the show, and please be sure to subscribe to the show on the iHeartRadio app, on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, Google Podcasts, wherever you find your podcast. Our guest today is J.C. Cervantes. She'll be here to celebrate the Lords of Night Shadow Bruja novel, and she'll be interviewed by our intern extraordinaire, Jordan Saley. Before we invite JC and Jordan into the studio, we want to let you know that this episode of the Reading with Your Kids podcast is brought to you by Ken, a beautiful picture book by Carolyn Nunez Vasquez. In Ken, we're going to meet Grace, and Grace listens to a story told to her by her grandmother. Her grandmother shares great wisdom, and at the feet of her grandmother, Grace learns the lessons of nature and of the heart. And that the greatest lesson of all is that we are all kin. Nature is much more than beauty to admire. Nature, animals, and plants teach children powerful lessons. Grace learns lessons about life and about friendship. Most of all, Grace's grandmother teaches Grace that goodness and love heal. Developing ourselves to see all people and living creatures as kin will heal our societies. Get your copy today, Kin, by Carolyn Nunez Vasquez. This episode of the podcast is also brought to you by Alicia Connected, The Big Gift, written by Derek Fisher. Alicia has finally entered a new world of technology when her parents give her a tablet for her birthday. She has watched and listened to her friends who just love the games and the apps that they've been playing with, and that Alicia has yet to experience until now. But using technology can bring a set of challenges that are new to both Alicia and her parents. Understanding the different apps and games and how to use them properly can be tricky. Will Alicia know how to use it in a way that is fun and allows her to connect with her friends while being safe and secure? This is a wonderful middle grade novel that you should read with your kids to help them become more literate about the media that they are consuming and to be safe while online. And to be honest with you, it can help us be safe online too. Alicia Connected, The Big Gift by Derek Fisher. It's a Purple Dragonfly Award winner.
Hello, and welcome to today's episode of the Reading with Your Kids podcast. I'm Jordan, and I'll be your host for the episode. Today I'm joined by J.C. Cervantes, the author of the new Lords of the Night novel. Jen is joining us from Houston right now. Did you want to tell us a bit about your book?
Yeah, hi, thanks for having me. So this book is a spinoff of the Storm Runner series, which was a trilogy starring Zayn Obispo, and it is steeped in Maya mythology. And Renata Santiago, the Shadow Bruja, Shadow Witch, popped onto the scene in The Firekeeper. And she was always very mysterious to me, and she was someone that I wanted to get to know better, but she wasn't the protagonist, so I didn't spend as much time with her as I wanted to. So when The Shadow Crosser ended, that was the third book in the Stormrunner trilogy, she was in that book as well, and I knew she had a story to tell. I knew there was more about her that I wanted to learn. I knew that she had mysterious powers that we hadn't tapped into yet. And so that's how and why the Lords of Night came to be, is that I just wanted to know more about Ren, and I knew she had a story to tell.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love the character Ren. I've been reading it recently. I love watching her struggle with anxiety and all that stuff. What made you decide to throw that into her character?
You know, I don't feel like I decide what happens with characters. I mean, they really do come to me very often fully formed. And early in my career, I would often try to control characters, and it never ended well. And so now I just really give them the space to breathe, and I give them the page to act out and to say the things that they want to say and be the people that they want to be. And she always, even though she has these very Zen-like qualities and she practices meditation and seems to be very mature for her age, she also has a lot of anxiety and isn't quite sure of her place in the world. And so what I love about this particular book is she has to go on this quest because the Aztec Lords of Night are awakening one by one, and she needs to keep them asleep. And she's failing because she's not finding them before they wake up. There are 9 lords. And we start to see her world crumble. And what does that mean for her when she's put under that kind of pressure? What happens to those Zen-like qualities? What happens to her meditation practice? What happens to, the way she sees the world through this really goodwill lens? It starts to really fall apart, and we see her leaning into darkness.
It's an awesome story, and I'm loving it. What ways do you see yourself in Ren, I guess, in your child self versus now in your adult life?
I definitely, as a kid, I think that I had those moments where I was unsure of myself and I wasn't quite sure where I belonged. And even though I had a group of friends, I often felt very different from them in the things that I wanted to do and the things that I wanted to pursue, didn't seem quote unquote cool enough. And, I think at that age, you really want to fit in and you want to belong. But how do you do that while you're still wrestling with your own authentic self and waiting for that part of who you are to emerge? I mean, it gets sticky and it's challenging. And so when I think about Ren, I mean, that's what connects me to her, is that feeling of where is my place in this world?
What did you want kids reading this and reading about Ren to take away from this? Did you have anything you wanted to throw in, or did it just kind of come to you?
Yeah, I never I don't think about my reader when I'm writing. I allow myself to be so steeped in the story that it literally becomes my reality, that I am a part of that world. And if I start thinking about this world and thinking about it as, oh, I'm writing a book, then I am pulled out of the flow and it doesn't feel as organic to the process. So as much as I love my readers and I want them to love the book, I'm not thinking about them when I'm writing the book.
Mm-hmm. That's a really good writing strategy. Honestly, I feel like oftentimes authors just try to please their reader, and then you can always tell. You can tell when you read a book and that their goal is just to please you. I love that you do this for yourself and it's well loved anyway.
Thank you.
Speaking of diving into that world, what made you decide to dive into Maya civilizations and magic and these shadow monsters and stuff?
Yeah. So I'm of Mexican descent. I was born and raised in San Diego, near the Tijuana border, spent a lot of time in Mexico. And just growing up in the family that I grew up in, my grandmother would tell me stories actually about Apush, the god of death, darkness, and destruction. And so it's actually not surprising to me that he came onto the scene as the big bad wolf, in the Storm Runner. And we really see his character as a god morph over the books. And then his very unique relationship with Ren has been a real pleasure to write. But I think that all of that comes from those stories that I was told and how fascinated I was by them. And, my culture plays such a powerful role in the books that I write. And I imagine that it will continue to be that way as I have more and more books produced. So, I don't know any other way to write than through that particular lens.
Those stories you were told as a child, you mentioned, do you see them as just stories, or do you believe in magic and all of that?
In my culture and in the family that I grew up in, there is an everyday mysticism to what we do. And so when I hear the term magic, I struggle a little bit with it, because I think when we hear magic, it's a very Eurocentric term oftentimes. Or even if we hear the word witch, right, it's very Eurocentric, or, we consider the black hat and the broom and, all of this kind of Western teachings around that particular title. And yet, there are still brujos in Mexico and they are still practicing, and it's a part of the everyday culture. And so I think because I was raised in that, and I was raised to look for synchronicities, and I was raised to look for or to feel energy forms around me. I think that plays a really powerful role in the worlds that I create, even though I didn't grow up in a world of dragons and monsters and villains and gods. I still grew up in a world that you look at everything through this lens of what if and possibility and mystery.
This book reminded me a lot of like books I read as a child, like Percy Jackson, Harry Potter, what inspired this book, or like your writings in general? I guess, what books did you read that made you want to become an author?
Well, I know a lot of writers, and I feel like they all came out of the womb wanting to be writers, and that was not my case. I was a storyteller from the time I was very young. I grew up in an oral storytelling tradition. And so for me, I wear that title much greater than I do writer or author. And I think we're all wired for story. So all of us are storytellers. But, as a voracious reader, I was a very early reader. I was reading, at the age of 4, and I consumed books. I mean, my parents could not keep enough books in the house for me. But I never thought of myself as a writer. And it wasn't until I was well into adulthood and my youngest daughter came to me and she asked me to write a story for her. And I put pen to paper and started writing, and I just fell in love with the process. And it really awakened something inside of me that I think had been dormant, since I was a child. And that story ended up becoming my very first novel.
Wow, that's awesome. As the title of this podcast is Reading with Your Kids, we like to talk about the importance of like reading with your kids, growing up around learning about novels and all that stuff. Do you ever read with your kids? And if so, what?
Yeah, so my kids are all grown now, but storytelling was a really powerful art form in our house. And I never told my kids to be readers. So first and foremost, they saw me consuming story and enjoying it. And I personally think that you can't force a child to be a reader, right? I think that you can lead them in that direction. I think that you can lead by example. But if a child is happy reading the back of their cereal box, that's great. If they want to read graphic novels, that's great. I mean, I think a lot of times adults and parents and teachers get caught up in, oh, you have to read the classics and you have to read this book. And then it becomes this chore for a child versus allowing them to choose, giving them the autonomy and the agency to select the stories that they want to allow into their hearts and minds. And I think that that's the more valuable asset is letting them choose and letting them do that. But I as my kids were growing up, they're all readers. I think when you're a reader, there was actually a study that was done on this, and the study essentially pointed out that, those who were lifelong readers, they earned more money and they had more successful lives. But here's the thing, people think, oh, it's because they are readers and they're more educated, and that wasn't it. What they found was people who consume stories become more empathic adults, because they have read diverse viewpoints, they've read about other cultures. And so that empathy makes them more, they have a better time communicating with people. And so then they do better at work, and they are more open-minded and flexible. And so that's the reason, according to this particular study, and I don't remember who conducted the study, but it was, Harvard University, something along those lines. And I thought that was really fascinating that we learn empathy through story.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that is so interesting. I mean, I couldn't have worded better myself. It does really help you like learn how to read from other people's point of view, I guess.
Yeah, that's really critical in today's world.
Mm-hmm. And I think you're totally right about I remember when I was in school, we were told to read like all these like classic novels like Lord of the Flies and all that. And like I would, as a kid being forced to read these, I didn't appreciate them as much as I should have, I guess, Right. So do you have like any thoughts on like, I guess like teachers' methods of like getting kids to read without forcing them?
Yeah, I think it starts at a really early age. And again, it's about sharing a love of story, right? I think the minute that you point to a kid and say, you have to read this book, it becomes more of a chore. But allowing them to have that agency that we talked about, I think is really important. And, I think that teachers have a really hard job. I mean, they're having to teach to state tests and they have all these pressures, and it is such a challenging profession that is changing every single day, culturally. And I think they deal with a lot of pressure. So, I don't think it's my place to judge how teachers play that role. But I do think that the teachers that allow their students selections and talk about reading in a really open way. So maybe even having the conversation, why don't you like to read? What is it about reading that's boring? And, you've got kids that are maybe dyslexic or they have other reading disabilities that are preventing them from enjoying and consuming stories. So is there another way that they can consume story? I mean, I think there are just so many, we could have a whole, hour probably talking about that. And I'm certainly not an expert, but for me, it always comes down to the love of story, period.
So for parents and kids like reading this novel together, what kind of conversations do you think they could have while reading it?
Oh, that's such a good question. I hope that they would have questions about loyalty, what it means to be a loyal human being and to be loyal to your friends. Ren is bullied. She is cyberbullied at the beginning of the book, and that really shapes who she is, and she really struggles with that. So I think that there's a lot to be said about searching for your own identity and becoming who you truly are without the outside pressures. And how do you deal with cyberbullying? And I think that, when I was growing up, we didn't have those pressures. We didn't have all the social media and the TikToks and the, so on and so forth. And so there wasn't that level. So once you left school, at least you could get away from it. Now I think kids are just completely barraged by it, 24/7. So I think that conversation can happen. And I think there's a conversation about the decisions we make. And is someone really all bad, or is there a gray area, And so we're all flawed. And what does that mean? And we see Ren go through these different iterations of herself and how flawed she is. So I think there are so many conversations to be had around the practical elements like bullying all the way over to, the way we see the world and the people in it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's something I love about your character, Ren. She, I feel like I always grew up seeing all these characters who were like, it was so just black and white, whether they were just like this amazing character or they're very clearly the villain. And I love the idea of seeing her struggle with her dark side, I guess. And I feel like it like shows kids like, oh, maybe it's not as simple as we once thought it was.
Yeah. And I think that, we run away from these shadow parts of ourselves, but that's part of being human. I mean, it's okay if you have a bad thought. It's okay if maybe you're really angry and in that moment you do want to take revenge. And what does that mean? And what do you do with that emotion? And because it's when you act on it, right, that becomes the more problematic part of it. And so I think having those conversations with kids, normalizing all of those emotions, whether it's hate or fear or anger or, wanting to take revenge, what does that mean versus, oh, you have to be all good all the time with pure thought. I mean, that's just not realistic.
Because the moment that a kid has a bad thought, I know when I was younger and I would have a bad thought, I'd be like, oh, does this make me a bad person?
Yeah, exactly. Because you don't know. I mean, you're young. And so, taking that guidance from your caretakers or your parents or grandparents or, whoever it is, I think is really critical to your development.
Yeah. So I think this is a really, really beautiful story to be told.
Thank you. Thank
and
you so much.
I know you mentioned that Ren, you found such an interesting character and wanted to dive into her more, and that's why you wrote this. Were there any other characters from either Stormire series or even just from this novel that you would like to dive in more and maybe do another story on or just use more in this book?
For right now, I feel like this world can be put to peace for a little while. It's interesting, though, Marco, who is the son of war, his father is the Maya god of war. he came onto the page in The Firekeeper, and I couldn't stand him. I mean, I thought he was so obnoxious. He made all the wrong decisions. He only thought about himself. He was so incredibly self-centered and selfish. And I'll be honest with you, like, I didn't like him at all. But he kept popping onto the page, and he kept popping onto the page. And so I just let him go with it. And I wanted to find out, like, why was he so angry? Why was he the way he was? And by the time I get to Shadowcrosser, I fell in love with him, and I understood him. And it was the reason that he came into this particular story. And he plays a role and goes on this quest with Ren, because not only did I want to explore him a little bit more, but I wanted the reader to see that he wasn't all those, kind of negative traits that I just mentioned.
And I love the way you talk about your characters. Like, even though you've created them, they're like their own people, and you even say, like, I hate this person. Like, I wanted to see why they keep popping up, even though, like, you write the story. Do you feel like, as these characters come to you, because it sounds so natural, do you feel like you're unraveling parts of yourself as you write? And is it like a bit, like, I guess, therapeutic for you to write these characters?
Yeah, I think that's a great way to look at it. I have, early in my career, I was asked, why are you a writer? Why do you write? And I grappled with that question for a really long time. And I finally realized I write to understand the world and my place in it. And so, yeah, I think it is therapeutic. I think it is cathartic. I think it is me trying to unravel and discover and figure things out.
To leave off the readers, where can people go to find this book or any other of your work that you'd want them to get a hold of?
Yeah, so they can go to their local bookstore. They can get online, and it's online. They can go to my website and see a listing of all the books that are available on the market now, and I have 3 more coming out next year. So I'm a busy writer.
Wow. Okay. Well, you hear it from here. Go check out Lords of the Night. Just came out this week.
Thank you so much.
Please be sure to join us for the next episode of the Reading with Your Kids podcast. Our guests will be Suzanne and Max Lang. They'll be here to celebrate their Grumpy Monkey series. This is a great series. The series goes from board books to graphic novels for young readers. It's a really fun interview. Max and Suzanne are a husband and wife team, author and illustrator, and it's really just a lot of fun. You don't want to miss it. That's the next episode of the podcast. Hey, if you're the author of a fantastic children's book, please visit our website, readingwithyourkids.com. Click in the author's Click Here button at the top of the page to find out how you can be a guest here on the podcast. Being a guest, it's fun, it's easy, it doesn't cost you a thing, and it gives you the chance in a long-form conversation to tell the world about your fantastic children's book. You can also learn how you can submit your book to our Certified Great Read panel, and you can find out how you can take part in our monthly promotion program. Learn all about that and more at readingwithyourkids.com and clicking on that author's Click Here button at the top of the page. I want to thank the folks who made today's show so wonderful. First, I want to start by thanking our guest, J.C. Cervantes. Please be sure to check out The Lords of Night. Also want to thank my co-host, my guest host today, Jordan Saley. I want to thank a special thank you to Skylar Strauss for editing this podcast. I want to thank our sponsors, Derek Fisher. Be sure to check out Alicia Connected and also Carolyn, known as Vasquez. Please check out Ken. I want to thank the rest of my team, Fatima Khan, Rory Grady, Mirabella Q. Of course, I want to thank my beautiful wife for all the support she gives me. Most of all, we all want to thank you. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. And as always, thank you so very much for taking the time to make the world a better place by reading with your kids. I'll be looking for you in the next edition of the Reading with Your Kids podcast.
Peace.